Thank you. Thank you. Thank you. Thank you very much. Harold, thanks for the introduction, and thanks for playing my theme song. You know, at the end of the week, I turned 65. I hate it, but I do. And so my memory's not what it was, and there for about 3 seconds, I thought I was still president when I heard you talk. First, to all the fine folks at the head table and all of you at the podium, I mean, I'm honored to be here. I thank you for what you said about Hillary and about me. I tried to be a friend of the firefighters when I was in office. I tried to remind the American people that it was dangerous and important work. Still, one of the most memorable experiences of my presidency was going to Worcester for that internationally attended memorial service for the firefighters who perished there. And like you, I'm really proud of the work Hillary did after 9/11, which will soon see its 10th anniversary. Those of us who live in New York are being treated now every day in the press, and I don't mean this in a negative way. It's very moving, but it's painful to stories of what happened then. And I happened to be with 2 men last week, one of whom rebuilt his firm after he lost a third of his employees on 9/11, and the other was the father of one of the people he lost. So I think that when you look at all these things being debated today, it's important to remember that this is important work. We did, as Harold said, we trained about 30,000 people in 100 cities to try to deal with the aftermath of terrorist attacks beginning in 1997, well before 9/11. We did begin to try to give funds, as you pointed out, to local fire departments so that they could be better emergency responders, recognizing that there's been a change in what it means to be a firefighter today. If you've been given this speech 20 years ago, you might not have even mentioned the fact that we had a good federal emergency management agency under James Lee Witt, and we professionalized it, and we made an error in abandoning that approach after I left office. I'm very proud of what Hillary did when she spent the weekend at home, as she does every chance she gets, and then she got up at 5 and left to go back to work at the State Department, and she said, "Don't forget to tell them I said hello. Working with those firefighters is one of the great honors of my life after 9/11. And there's still a lot of work to be done. But she believed, and as you all know, got money set aside to deal with the health problems that firefighters had because of their exposure to dust, chemicals, and other things working through the rubble of 9/11. And I think it's important that as we come up on this anniversary, we not only focus on the terrible thing that happened that day, how fortunate we are that it hasn't happened again, how vigilant we need to be, but we also need to remember the unfinished business of 9/11. I wanted to say one other thing. This union endorsed another friend of mine, Terry McAuliffe, when he ran for governor of Virginia, and he wanted to come with me today. But he's doing something we need more Americans to do. Terry McAuliffe went to China and bought 2 car factories and moved them to America. He is moving them to America. And we need more of that. He also did something else that you might be interested in. It doesn't directly affect you, but it will help the working people of this country. We've lost a lot of paper mills in America because we're more electronic now. That's a good thing, actually, in many ways. But there are a lot of people all over America who had jobs that were good union jobs in those paper mills, and they were left out. And also, it's a terrible waste to have those big facilities. And so International Paper closed one in Virginia and put it up for bid. McAuliffe won the bid. And you know what they're doing? They are producing hard pellets made of wood that they are selling 100% exports to Denmark and Germany. Now, this is important. People say, oh, you know, that there are no good ideas about what to do about the economy. Consider this. All of those countries in Europe adopted these cap and trade systems to try to reduce their carbon emissions. They can't afford to shut down all their coal plants. It is now possible. There is a machine that will make wood pellets from wood waste. You don't have to cut down trees. From wood waste that are so hard, you can put them in a driving rainstorm and they won't get soggy. And they have the same heat content as coal does. So to meet their reduction targets, the Europeans are replacing 20% of their coal with these wood pellets, and they're coming from Virginia, thanks to Terry McAuliffe, a lot of them. Now, what's the point of that for America's future? You say, well, Bill, that's just one deal. That market is 11 million tons this year. In 3 years, it'll be 112 million tons. There are lots of things we can do. And so I'd like to say just a couple of words about the great struggle that's going on in the country today. I was standing backstage listening to Harold do his riff on what's happening in Washington. And it was all I could do not to sort of start cheering. And look, I'm not running for anything. I can't, and I spend my life working on my foundation now. And my work is supported by Republicans and Democrats and independents and people all over the world. But this is not your father's Republican Party. I'll just give you an example of a guy that wasn't too friendly to unions and ask you if you can imagine this happening today. There was a Republican businessman named Ken Iverson from North Carolina who established a company called Nucor. Now, Nucor used recycled steel. They didn't pour the steel originally to cut the cost. And when I was governor, they already had about 9 plants in America, and one of them was in Arkansas. The wages were lousy, but they got weekly bonuses based on income. And when you went to work there, they told you that they had a strict no layoff policy, so that if they didn't make as much money next year as they did this year, everybody's bonus would be cut, but nobody would lose their job or their health care or their retirement program. 1 year in the mid-'80s, when those of you who are old enough will remember the middle of the country was really hurting and industrial jobs were being lost, they had the first year where they didn't make more money than they did the previous year. They made money, but just less. So Iverson sent a letter. I've still got it in my files. It said to the employees, I hate it that I have to do this, but your bonus will be 20% lower this year. This is not your fault. You did everything I asked you to do. But it is my fault. I should have been smart enough to make sure we're the only company in the world making steel that wasn't affected by this downturn. And because I didn't, I'm cutting my pay 3 times the percentage, not as much, the percentage yours did, I'm cutting my pay by 60%. Needless to say, nobody walked off the job. Can you imagine that happening in the aftermath of this bank crisis? And by the way, in the 80s, you got $1,500 a kid for every child you had in college over and above your wage and bonus. And there was one guy in South Carolina put 8 children through college working there. He must have quit from exhaustion when they got out. But anyway, okay, fast forward to 2009. In 2009, they lost money for the first time, almost $300 million. They'd never lost money before. Iverson is no longer with us. The president said, culture is still alive and well. I hate it, but your income's going down. And your hours will have to go down, but your benefits are secure. Nobody gets laid off. The education bonus for kids is now $2,750. If you want to go back to college, you get $3,000 a year. If your spouse wants to go, there's a subsidy for the spouse too. What am I saying? This doesn't have to be a partisan deal. This is about whether you believe America is a country where we do best when we share the responsibilities and share the benefits, and where we try to create a future that we share. And for 30 years now, we've been moving more and more into the hands politically of people who tell us that the government is the source of all the problems. You name a problem, the government's the problem. If we just had lower taxes, fewer programs, and weaker regulation, cutting the cancer of government out of our lives, all would be well. I got tickled. I watched Governor Perry announce for president. He's a good-looking rascal, and he's strong. And he said, you know, I'm going to Washington to make sure that the federal government stays as far away from you as possible, while I ride on Air Force One and that Marine One helicopter and go to Camp David and travel around the world and have a big time. I mean, this is crazy. Look, every person, including even public employees, can think of a tax they thought was too high, a program they thought was nuts, a regulation they thought didn't make any sense. And criticizing the government's part of the birthright of America. After all, we were born in reaction to unaccountable government from King George and the Parliament. Right? We've all done it. But there is not a single, solitary, successful nation on earth today that does not have both an effective government and a good economy. And in the world we live in, you can't have them unless you have both. So the thing that bothers me about this debate in Washington is that it makes us major into minors, and it's likely to give us policies that will make the economy worse. Harold mentioned, you know, we had a surplus. We had 3 surpluses in a row. I left enough money to pay down $600 billion on the national debt, and President Bush took $150 billion of it away, and so only paid $450 billion down. I apologize for that, but the other $150 billion went to tax cuts to people in my income group who didn't need it. And I apologize for that. And so we've been doing this a long time. In 1981, when we elected a president who convinced us that government would mess up a 2-car parade, and, you know, we liked him, and he and Tip O'Neill did fine, and it was somehow more rhetoric than reality, but it was the first time we had ever run permanent deficits, big ones. It's very important that you understand this. From the founding of our country through 1981, including World War II, our national debt was a grand total of $1 trillion. The whole shebang. When President George H.W. Bush took office, it was $3 trillion. When he left office, it was $4.5 trillion. Went up, so it tripled, then went up by 50% again. And Pleasant's already tried to do something about it, and it probably got him beat. I was the ultimate beneficiary of it. But you remember when he signed the bill that the Congress passed in 1990, which had 2 provisions. It had some modest tax increases and a provision called pay-go. You pay for things as you go along. If you want a new program, you got to pay for it by raising money or stop doing something else. So Newt Gingrich thought that would cause the very pillars of civilization to fall. And he went after President Bush, made him first minority leader and then Speaker of the House, and helped to weaken President Bush in his run for re-election. So then we passed the economic plan in '93 without a single vote from the other party, and it reduced the deficit by 90%. Then they shut the government down twice because they wanted me to get rid of the government, to wreck the union movement, undermine public employee unions, cut education, health. You remember the whole deal. And so we had a fight, and we won, and then we worked together. We passed a balanced budget bill. We wound up with 3 surpluses. Then in 2001, it was the first time that the anti-government bloc had had both the White House and majorities in both houses of Congress. It was a curse that President George W. Bush had to bear. You know that old thing is life's greatest curse can be answered prayers. You actually get to see what happens if you do what you've been talking about for 20 years. And to be fair to him, there was a brief downturn in the economy caused by the so-called bursting of the tech bubble. But let me give you, just before everybody gets carried away with that, it's very different than what's happening now. The bursting of the tech bubble happened because the stocks of internet companies were bid up higher than they were worth. For example, and the investors were reacting to things like the fact that telecommunication services, listen to this, increased by 500% a year from 1997 to 1999. A year. And when the bubble burst, you know what happened? It dropped to a 50% a year increase. We would kill, wouldn't we, to have any business increasing its income at 50% a year now. But that happened. Then 9/11 happened, and that required more investment. We had to go into Afghanistan. We had to go after Mr. bin Laden. We had to get our act organized in America and try to strengthen our defenses against terrorist attacks. But it's the first time, and then the president also made a decision to go into Iraq. It's the first time in the history of America, ever, that we cut taxes in wartime. Going all the way back to George Washington, it never happened before. But the leader of the anti-government forces in the House then, Tom DeLay, said, and I quote, "There is nothing more important in wartime than to cut taxes." Why? Because I said it, that's why. So we were off to the races. It's very important that you know that before this financial crash, before the crash, the United States economy had only produced 2.5 million jobs. Most of them in the public sector because of the Homeland Security spending since I left office, compared with 22.7 million in the 8 years before. Before the crash, median family income, the one in the middle, not the average, that includes guys like me. You got to be careful when somebody says average. Just remember, if somebody puts a pot of boiling water on the floor and a pot of freezing water on the floor, if average really was everything, if you put 1 foot in the hot water and 1 foot in cold, you ought to feel just fine. Just remember. So, I say that because the median is the one in the middle. That tells you more. Median family income after inflation was $2,000 lower than it was the day I left office before the crash. This deal doesn't work. And yet, the American people rewarded it again in 2010. And there are lots of reasons for why that happened. First of all, Democrats barely get hired except when things are messed up, and therefore we're expected to fix them, and people didn't feel fixed on Election Day. And they thought, oh, the bailout, the financial reform, the student loan reform, the health care, and all amounts to a lot of government. But I don't believe the American people voted for what they see unfolding in Washington today. I think it's important to understand that if you look across the world since World War II, when there is a financial collapse, the kind of thing that just happened to us, it typically takes longer to get out of. And a stimulus bill can do a lot of good to put a floor under it, but you can't actually get out of it until banks start lending and companies start spending and people start borrowing again. So this idea that the stimulus failed is actually not true. But you should ask yourself, how many of you know this? Probably most of you do. That stimulus bill, that much derided stimulus bill, was $800 billion, give or take. More than a third of it went to tax cuts. And the voters didn't know it because they were given out in ways that were best for the voters. They just reduced people's payroll tax deductions. And so you got a little along and then went and spent it, but it didn't say, there was no sort of neon day glow sign on a check that said brought to you by Barack Obama and the Democratic Party. They just cut their spending. Good economics, but not very good politics. The Republicans opposed it, I think, in part because only the bottom 95% of us got tax cuts. I got cut out of that one, thank God. That's 36% of it. Then 30% of it went to state and local government, which you do know about, to keep from laying off people like you. And it must have worked because it ran out and we've lost 500,000 public jobs at the state and local level this year alone. And that's one of the reasons growth's been so anemic. That's canceled most of the private sector gains. Only about 30% of that money went to what people think of as stimulus, infrastructure projects and tax incentives and other things to promote manufacturing, principally in green energy. People tell you, oh, it didn't work. I'll give you one little statistic. On the day President Obama took office, the United States had 2% of the world market for these high-powered batteries that are used in hybrid electric and all-electric cars. On the day the Republicans won every major election in Michigan, the country had 20% of the world market with 30 new factories, 18 of them built or under construction in Michigan, which this year had the biggest drop in unemployment of any state in the country. Talk about bad timing for our side. But these are facts. And if we keep the same incentive structure in place, we'll have 40% of the world market. Can you imagine America having 40% of the world market and manufacturing anything? It's been 30 years since we could say that. We'll have 40% of the world market by 2014. So what happened in that little tax compromise last December? The leaders of the other party said, you got to keep Bill Clinton's tax cuts. God only knows what would happen if we asked the job creators to do anything. But we insist that you get rid of this tax provision which gives a tax credit to the manufacturers of new clean energy products. You know why? They said it was a spending program. You know why? Because a lot of these companies making these batteries are startups. And if you're a startup, a tax credit's no good to you because you got no income in the past to credit it against. So they gave the startups a cash equivalent and said, if you're still in business with this many employees 2 years from now, you can keep it, otherwise you got to give it back. We were growing like a runaway freight train, so they got rid of that because they said that's spending, not a tax cut. Give me a break. Why am I telling you all this? Because I don't think most people know it, for one thing. And for another, this is what works. Look at the places in America. San Diego, the biotech center of America. Cleveland, an industrial city reborn in its rising healthcare cooperation. Pittsburgh, similar stories. Silicon Valley booming again. Austin trying to become the first truly energy independent city in America. and my personal favorite, Orlando, where you have massive investments every year by the Defense Department's training program, where NASA's pretty close by at Cape Canaveral, and where you have Disney World and Universal Entertainment Parks, and a group called Entertainment Arts has its video game facility there, and the University of Central Florida, the biggest unknown university in America with 53,000 students, is training people to do the sign of work. And you know what they're doing? Computer simulation, and they all need it. The Pentagon does it because they save a double ton of money training people to fly those expensive jet airplanes without putting the planes at risk, for example, or to use sophisticated weapons without risking kids getting shot. Universal and Disney like it because it makes their exhibits more interesting. And the video game folks like it because it makes their games more exciting. So what happened? They have 100 new companies doing computer simulation work. They don't know all this bad economy's going on. And everybody at University of Central Florida can train, moves in there and gets a job. Why am I telling you this? Because this is what works when people sit down together and cooperate. Conflict may be good politics. Bad-mouthing the government may be good politics. But in this case, you had the Defense Department, NASA, a university with federal research money and training money and student aid, working with all these big private sector people. You want to bring this economy back? We have to behave like Americans again. We have to have the same sense of cooperation and planning and devotion to each other's well-being that every single person in New York City did on the day after 9/11. That's what we have to do. And if we do it, we can get there. And you are never going to do it. You are never going to do it by hating your government and telling everybody that it's incompetent. If it was so great, we'd have the lowest unemployment rate among all the advanced countries. That's not true. Among the 33 countries in the OECD, that's a big group of upper-income countries, we have the 9th highest unemployment rate. 24 of them are doing better than we are. I give you lots of other statistics. Point I want to make is, when you see these assaults on the public sector unions, it's one thing for a governor in any state to go to the firefighters or the AFSCME or anybody else and say, look, the people that pay your salaries are in trouble. They don't have any tax money to pay. My ability to raise money is limited. We're going through a horrible time. Sit down with me and let's work through this and see how we're going to get through the next 3 years. Now, that's what we do if we were running this country on a daily basis the way we acted the day after 9/11. Firefighters are not idiots. You got to be smart to stay alive in adverse circumstances. Anybody knows there's an arithmetic problem out there. But what happened? The guy in Wisconsin used it as an excuse to try to destroy the public sector unions. So that, just as you said in your speech, we would not only concentrate more wealth in the top 1% of our country, we'd concentrate more power too. And I'll just leave you with that. All this anti-government Tea Party rhetoric has great appeal when you hear it. But let's not forget, from World War II to 1980, the bottom 90% of us took home about 65% of national income every year. The top 10% took home 35%. The top 1% took home 9%. That was enough inequality to spur people to work harder, be clever, create jobs, and enough equality to build the greatest middle class the world has ever known. Since we were subject to changes in the global economy, more competition from overseas, and this anti-government, anti-tax movement, the bottom 90% share of national income's dropped from 65 to 52. The bottom 10%'s gone from 35 to 48. And the top 1%'s gone from 9 to 21. And in the last decade, 40% of the income gains went to the top 1%. This deal doesn't work. And the American people inadvertently voted for more of it in 2010 because the Tea Party said that they were offended by the bailout. Weren't we all? But what was the alternative? The problem that bothered me was not that the financial system was saved. That needed to be done. The largest car dealer in America had stopped financing new cars. It was about to get to the point where you couldn't go to Sears and buy a home appliance on an installment plan. But we shouldn't have stopped there. We bailed out the banks, but not the homeowners. And we're going to have to do, we've still got to do something. We're going to clean up those balance sheets and get them going. But this same crowd is now trying to repeal the financial reform bill. Why? Because the financial reform bill finally gives the government the authority over all kinds of investors to say, if you're going to take these big risks with the future of your depositors' money and our country, you have to have enough capital to cover your own losses. There will be no more bailouts, and we're going to try to prevent future failures. And if you get around it, here's the bankruptcy procedure. In other words, the bill bans bailouts. Now, nobody knew that in the last election either. One thing you got to say about my party, we're good at keeping a secret. But don't anybody ever let you tell you the Democrats can't keep a secret. I can just show you that. But it bans, you're not going to, so they want to repeal the bill that bans bailouts. Why? Because that's what, follow the money. So I just tell you, I'm grateful to you and what you do. I'm grateful for what you stand for. This is not about party. I mentioned one Republican. You want to read a book by a good Republican that will make you can read in an hour and a half. It'll make you think through this. It's called Enough, Period. Enough, Period. By John Bogle, B-O-G-L-E. John's about 85 or 86 years old now. He's from Philadelphia. He started these stock index funds, made a handsome income. He thinks his industry takes too much out of America's economic pie. He says finance is an intermediary institution. If we take too much, there's not enough left to start new businesses and grow new jobs. And he tells you what's wrong with what happened to America, a good Republican. This is not a party deal. This is about whether we're going to have a country of shared benefits and shared responsibilities. This is about whether we're going to behave just a little more every day the way we all behaved after our hearts were broken on 9/11. And you guys got to lead that charge. Look, there is nothing wrong with this country. We still have the biggest economy in the world. We got people here from all over the world. We're friendlier, we're more comfortable with immigrants and diversity than anybody else, so we're in a better position to do business with people everywhere. We have massive natural resources. All these international scales say we're first or second in the world in the capacity to generate electricity from the sun or the wind. And I could give you 50 other examples of America's assets. And yes, we can pay our bills back. Our national assets are worth approximately $58 trillion. But we can't do it if we are in the grip of a truly bad idea. You may not get the right answer if you ask the right question, but if you ask the wrong question, you can get the right answer. How can we weaken the government, break every union in sight, convince the American people there's no such thing as a good tax or a bad tax cut, no such thing as a good regulation or a bad deregulation, no such thing as a good program or a bad program cut? How can we do that? That is the wrong question. The right question is, how can we have the kind of government and the kind of private sector and the kind of cooperation we need to build a 21st century economy that every single American has a chance to succeed in, that will allow people who come here poor and work their hearts out to work their way into the middle class, and middle-class people to give their kids a better chance to chase their own dreams? That is the right question. We ask the right question, we've got a pretty good chance of getting the right answer. Thank you, and God bless you.